3,500 children faced 20,000 soldiers across an open field. The soldiers were Brazilians, Argentines, veterans of a 6-year war. They had artillery, they had cavalry, they had rifles and bayonets and the full weight of 3 nations behind them. The children had sticks. Some had rifles. Most did not. They carried wooden poles sharpened at the end, farming tools, whatever they could find. Some had painted beards on their faces, black streaks of charcoal smeared across their cheeks and chins. They were pretending to be men, boys, 9 years old, 12 years old, 15 years old. Behind them stood a few hundred adults, old men with grey hair, wounded soldiers missing arms, missing legs, held upright by wooden crutches, women who had followed the army across a ruined country. This was Paraguay's last army, not because they chose to send children, because there was no one else left. The war had killed the fathers. It had killed the older brothers. It had killed every man of fighting age, until the only ones remaining were boys who had not yet grown tall enough to hold a rifle properly. The Brazilian commander looked across the field. He saw the small figures. He saw the fake beards. He knew what he was about to do. He gave the order anyway. The cavalry charged. The man who sent these children here, the dictator who started this war, who refused every chance to end it, was already gone. He had fled days earlier. He left them behind to die so he could keep running. His name was Francisco Solano Lopez. 6 years before this field, Paraguay was a small but stable nation of nearly 500,000 people. Lopez believed he could make it an empire. He was wrong about everything. Paraguay in the 1860s was easy to miss. A small landlocked country in the heart of South America. No coastline, no major ports. Surrounded on all sides by larger, stronger neighbors. To the east and south, Brazil, the largest nation in South America, with a population of 9 million and the continent's most powerful military. To the west and south, Argentina, wealthy, ambitious, with over 1 million people and growing influence. Paraguay had fewer than 500,000. On a map, it looked like a piece of meat trapped between 2 hungry dogs. But Paraguay had survived. For decades, it had kept to itself. It avoided foreign entanglements. It built walls, not physical walls, but walls of isolation. Few foreigners were allowed in. Few Paraguayans were allowed out. The country was a closed box. This was the work of one family, the Lopez dynasty. Paraguay's first Lopez was named Carlos Antonio. He took power in 1841 and ruled for over 20 years. He was a dictator, but a careful one. He modernized the country without opening it to the outside world. He built roads and schools. He created South America's first railroad. He installed telegraph lines. He stockpiled weapons. He also kept Paraguay neutral. While Brazil and Argentina flexed their muscles across the region, Carlos Antonio Lopez smiled and nodded and stayed out of their way. He understood something important. Paraguay was too small to fight its neighbors. Survival meant patience. Survival meant silence. Survival meant never giving the giants a reason to notice you. In 1862, Carlos Antonio Lopez died. His son took over. Francisco Solano Lopez was nothing like his father. He was 35 years old when he became president. He had spent years traveling through Europe, visiting courts and capitals, studying how great powers operated. One trip changed him. In Paris, Lopez became obsessed with Napoleon Bonaparte. He read everything about the French emperor. He studied his campaigns. He memorized his tactics. He dressed like him. The military uniforms, the decorations, the posture. He grew his hair in the same style. He posed for portraits with one hand tucked into his coat. Napoleon had taken a small nation and conquered Europe. He had bent the world to his will through sheer force of personality and military genius. Lopez looked in the mirror and saw the same potential. He also found something else in Paris. A woman. Her name was Eliza Lynch. She was Irish, beautiful, ambitious, and looking for a way out of Europe. Lopez fell hard. He brought her back to Paraguay and made her his mistress. She would stay by his side for the rest of his life. Eliza Lynch saw what Lopez saw, a man destined for greatness. She encouraged his ambitions. She helped him believe that Paraguay could become a power. Together they returned to a small country with big dreams. Lopez inherited a stable nation. His father had left him a full treasury, a trained army, and no enemies. Within 3 years, he would have spent the treasury, destroyed the army, and made enemies of everyone. But first, he prepared for war. Lopez did not know who he would fight. He just knew he would fight someone. Great men fight wars. Napoleon fought wars. Therefore, Francisco Solano Lopez would fight a war. He expanded the army from 7,000 to nearly 30,000, the largest military force in South America relative to population. He hired European advisors to train his troops in modern tactics. He built a massive fortress called Humaitá on the Paraguay River, with enough guns to destroy any fleet that tried to pass. The fortress was called the Gibraltar of South America. Lopez believed it made him untouchable. He stockpiled weapons. He stockpiled ammunition. He built foundries to manufacture more. Paraguay was still small, but Lopez believed that willpower could overcome numbers, that courage could defeat size, that he, the Napoleon of South America, could bend history to his vision. He was looking for a fight. In 1864, he found one. The trouble started in Uruguay. Uruguay was a small country too, caught between Brazil and Argentina, just like Paraguay. It had 2 political factions, the Colorados and the Blancos, who hated each other and fought constantly. The Blancos were in power. They were friendly to Paraguay. They were also annoying Brazil. Brazilian ranches near the Uruguayan border were being raided. Cattle were being stolen. Brazilian citizens were being killed. Brazil demanded that Uruguay do something about it. Uruguay did nothing. In 1864, Brazil invaded. Brazilian troops crossed into Uruguay to support the Colorados against the Blancos. It was a blatant interference in a sovereign nation's affairs. But Brazil was big and Uruguay was small, and big nations do what they want. Lopez watched this happen. He saw Brazil swallowing Uruguay. He saw the regional balance shifting. He saw his Blanco allies about to be crushed, and he saw an opportunity. If he defended Uruguay, he would be the hero, the protector of small nations, the man who stood up to the bully. Other countries would rally to his side. Paraguay would become the leader of a coalition against Brazilian aggression. This was his moment, his chance to be Napoleon. He sent a message to Brazil: withdraw from Uruguay or face war. Brazil ignored him. On November 12, 1864, Lopez seized a Brazilian steamship called the Marquês de Olinda. The governor of a Brazilian province was on board. Lopez took him prisoner. Then Lopez invaded. Paraguayan troops poured into Mato Grosso, a Brazilian province to the north. They captured towns. They seized weapons. They won easy victories against unprepared defenders. Lopez was thrilled. The war was going exactly as he had planned. But he had a problem. Paraguay was landlocked. To reach Uruguay, the country he was supposedly defending, he needed to cross Argentina. There was no other way. Lopez sent a request to Argentina. Let my army pass through your territory. Argentina said no. This should have given Lopez pause. Argentina was not his enemy. They had no quarrel. He was asking them to violate their neutrality and risk war with Brazil for his benefit. When they refused, the sane response would have been to reconsider, to negotiate, to find another way. Lopez declared war on Argentina. In 3 months, he had turned a regional dispute into a continental war. He had attacked the 2 largest nations in South America. He had made enemies of everyone, and he had done exactly what his father had spent 20 years avoiding. He had given the giants a reason to notice Paraguay. On May 1st, 1865, Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay signed a secret treaty. They called it the Treaty of the Triple Alliance. The terms were simple. The 3 nations would combine their forces. They would invade Paraguay. They would not stop until Lopez was dead or surrendered. They would carve up Paraguayan territory among themselves. The treaty was supposed to remain secret. It did not. When the terms leaked, the world saw what this war really was. Not a defensive action, not a response to aggression, a war of annihilation. Lopez read the treaty. He understood what it meant. 3 nations had agreed that he must die. A different man might have reconsidered, might have sought peace, might have realized that his Napoleon fantasy was about to destroy everything. Lopez doubled down. He told his people that Paraguay was fighting for survival. that the alliance wanted to wipe them off the map, that surrender meant extinction. He was not entirely wrong. The treaty did call for Paraguay's dismemberment. Brazil and Argentina would take huge chunks of territory. Paraguay would become a rump state, powerless and humiliated. But Lopez left out the part where he had started the war, the part where every escalation had been his choice, the part where peace was still possible if he would simply stop. He would not stop. The math was impossible. Paraguay, 450,000 people. Brazil, 9 million. Argentina, 1.5 million. Uruguay, 250,000. And now fighting against Paraguay. Combined, the alliance had over 10 million people. Paraguay was outnumbered more than 20-1. Lopez had 30,000 soldiers, well-trained, well-equipped, the best army he could build. The alliance could raise hundreds of thousands. This was not a war Paraguay could win. Every general knew it. Every diplomat knew it. The numbers did not lie. But Lopez believed in himself. He believed his fortress was impregnable. He believed his soldiers were worth 10 of the enemy. He believed that destiny was on his side. He believed he was Napoleon. Napoleon had lost at Waterloo. Lopez would lose something far worse. The war started well for Lopez. His invasion of Mato Grosso had been a success. Paraguayan troops captured Brazilian towns, seized weapons and supplies, and met little resistance. The defenders were unprepared. The victories were easy. Lopez launched a second invasion, south into Argentina, toward the province of Corrientes. Another easy conquest. More territory, more glory. He was winning. Then everything fell apart. Lopez had a plan, a grand strategy worthy of Napoleon. He would attack in two directions at once. One army would push through Argentina toward Uruguay. Another would sweep down from Mato Grosso. The two forces would link up, crush the allies between them, and win the war in a single campaign. It was ambitious. It was bold. It was exactly what Napoleon would have done. It was also a disaster. The southern invasion collapsed first. Paraguayan forces pushed into Argentina, expecting the locals to welcome them as liberators. They did not. Argentine resistance stiffened. The Paraguayan army found itself overextended, undersupplied, and far from home. At the Battle of Yatay in August 1865, a Paraguayan force was surrounded and destroyed. 3,000 men, dead or captured. An entire army wiped out in a single afternoon. The northern invasion fared no better. The Paraguayan column, marching down from Mato Grosso, was too slow. It arrived too late. The link-up never happened. By the end of 1865, both invasions had failed. Lopez had lost nearly 30,000 men, his entire pre-war army, without achieving anything. He had captured territory he could not hold. He had stretched his forces across hundreds of miles of hostile land. He had proven that his grand strategy was fantasy, and the alliance had not even begun to fight. In early 1866, the Allies invaded Paraguay. They came from the south, crossing the Paraná River, with a combined force of nearly 50,000 men. Brazilians, Argentines, Uruguayans, the largest army South America had ever seen. Lopez fell back. He abandoned his conquests. He pulled his remaining forces behind the river systems and swamps that protected Paraguay's heartland. He still had Humaitá, the great fortress, the Gibraltar of South America. As long as Humaitá held, he believed, Paraguay could survive. The Allies advanced slowly. The terrain was brutal. Swamps, rivers, dense forests. Disease killed as many men as bullets, but they kept coming. By May 1866, the two armies faced each other near a place called Tuyuti. Lopez decided to attack. The Battle of Tuyuti was the largest battle in South American history. It would remain so for over a century. On May 24, 1866, Lopez threw 24,000 Paraguayan soldiers at 35,000 Allied troops, dug into defensive positions. He attacked across open ground. He attacked prepared defenses. He attacked with inferior numbers. It was madness. The Paraguayans came in waves. They charged through marshes and across open fields, into the teeth of artillery and rifle fire. They fought with desperate courage. They kept coming, even as their ranks were torn apart. The Allies held. For 4.5 hours, the killing continued. Paraguayan units were shredded. Entire regiments ceased to exist. Officers fell at the front of their men. Soldiers died in heaps. By the end of the afternoon, over 6,000 Paraguayans were dead. Another 7,000 were wounded. Lopez had lost more than half of his attacking force. Allied casualties were heavy too, around 4,000. But they could replace their losses. They had millions of people to draw from. Paraguay could not replace anything. Tuyuti should have ended the war. Lopez had just destroyed his best army. His trained veterans, the soldiers his father had spent years building, were gone, rotting in the swamps around a pointless battlefield. Any rational leader would have sued for peace. The terms would have been harsh, but Paraguay would have survived. Lopez would have been exiled, perhaps, but his country would have lived. Lopez was not rational. He blamed his generals. He blamed his soldiers. He blamed everyone except himself, and he kept fighting. After Tuyuti, both armies were exhausted. The Allies had won, but they had paid for it. They needed time to regroup, to bring up reinforcements, to prepare for the next push. Lopez used the time to rebuild. He conscripted every man he could find. He pulled slaves from plantations and put rifles in their hands. He lowered the age of conscription. Boys who should have been in school were now in uniform. By September 1866, he had scraped together enough men for one more throw of the dice. The Allies made it easy for him. In September, the Allied commanders decided to assault a Paraguayan position called Curupayty. It was a fortified line of trenches and batteries overlooking the Paraguay River. Well designed, well defended. The Allies attacked anyway. They sent 20,000 men across open ground toward the Paraguayan trenches. It was the same mistake Lopez had made at Tuyuti, but worse. The ground was narrower. The defenses were stronger. The killing zone was tighter. The Paraguayans waited until the attackers were close. Then they opened fire. The slaughter lasted hours. Wave after wave of Allied soldiers walked into a wall of bullets and cannon fire. They fell in rows. They piled on top of each other. They died in such numbers that the survivors had to climb over their bodies to retreat. When it was over, the Allies had lost nearly 9,000 men. Paraguay had lost 92. Curupayty was the greatest victory in Paraguayan history. It was also the worst thing that could have happened. Lopez looked at the battlefield. He saw the Allied dead stacked like cordwood. He saw his own losses, almost nothing, and he drew exactly the wrong conclusion. He believed he could win. Curupayty convinced Lopez that his strategy was working, that defense was the answer, that if he just held on long enough, the Allies would break. They would give up. They would go home. He did not understand that Curupayty was a fluke, a single battle where everything went right. The Allies had made a stupid mistake, and Paraguay had made them pay. It would not happen again. The Allies learned from Curupayty. They stopped attacking fortified positions head-on. They started going around. They used their superior numbers to flank, to encircle, to strangle, and they settled in for a siege. Humaitá, the fortress Lopez had built to protect Paraguay, the strongest position in South America, the rock on which the alliance would break. The siege lasted 2 years. From 1866 to 1868, the Allies surrounded Humaitá. They cut its supply lines. They bombarded it with artillery. They used ironclad warships to control the river. They did not attack directly. They had learned that lesson. Instead, they waited. They starved the garrison. They let disease and hunger do what bullets could not. Inside the fortress, men were dying, not from combat, from starvation, from cholera, from fevers that swept through the cramped positions. The defenders ate horses. They ate rats. They ate leather. Lopez sent orders. Hold at all costs. They held, month after month, year after year, dying slowly while their commander refused to let them retreat. In July 1868, the Allies finally took Humaitá. By then, it barely mattered. The garrison was a skeleton. The fortress was a ruin. The men who had held it for 2 years were ghosts, hollow-eyed survivors who could barely stand. Lopez had sacrificed them for nothing. The fall of Humaitá broke Paraguay's back. The road to Asunción, the capital, was now open. There was nothing left to stop the Allied advance, and there was almost no one left to fight. By 1868, Paraguay had lost over 60,000 men. The pre-war army was gone. The first wave of conscripts was gone. The second wave was gone. Lopez needed soldiers. He did not care where they came from. He conscripted slaves. He conscripted the elderly, men in their 60s and 70s who could barely march. He conscripted the wounded, soldiers missing arms, missing legs, who had already given enough. And he conscripted children. The age of military service dropped, first to 16, then to 15, then lower. Boys who had never held a weapon were handed rifles and told to fight. Women took over everything else. They ran the farms. They built fortifications. They carried supplies to the front. Paraguay had become a nation of women and children because the men were all dead. The economy collapsed. The fields lay fallow. There was no one to plant, no one to harvest. People starved, not just soldiers, but civilians. The entire country was dying. Any sane leader would have surrendered. Lopez was no longer sane. The Allies offered peace. Multiple times. They promised to spare his life if he stepped down. They promised to preserve Paraguay if he simply stopped fighting. He refused. He told his people that surrender meant death, that the Allies would slaughter them all, that fighting was the only option. It was a lie. The Allies wanted to end the war. They were tired of bleeding. They would have accepted almost any terms that removed Lopez from power. But Lopez would rather watch Paraguay die than admit he was wrong. On January 1st, 1869, the Allies marched into Asunción. The capital fell without a fight. There was no one left to defend it. Lopez fled north into the countryside. He took what remained of his army, a ragged collection of wounded men, old men, and children, and disappeared into the wilderness. The war should have been over. It was not. Lopez refused to surrender, refused to negotiate, refused to accept that he had lost. He would keep fighting. He would keep running. He would keep sending men to die. And when he ran out of men, he would send boys. Lopez ran. He took what remained of his government, his ministers, his mistress Eliza Lynch, his children, and fled north into the Paraguayan wilderness. Behind him, Allied troops occupied Asunción. They looted the capital. They raised their flags over the presidential palace. The war was over. Everyone knew it. Everyone except Lopez. He still had soldiers. Not many. A few thousand men scattered across the countryside. Wounded veterans. Old conscripts. Boys. He gathered them in the hills. He told them the fight would continue. He told them Paraguay would never surrender. And then he started killing his own people. The paranoia had always been there. Lopez had never trusted anyone completely. He suspected plots everywhere. He saw betrayal in every sideways glance, every whispered conversation, every moment of hesitation. But after the fall of Asunción, the paranoia consumed him. He became convinced that he was surrounded by traitors, that his own officers were planning to overthrow him, that his own family was conspiring with the enemy. He decided to root them out. The San Fernando massacres began in 1868 and continued into 1869. Lopez ordered the arrest of hundreds of prominent Paraguayans, generals who had served him loyally, ministers who had run his government, priests, bishops, businessmen, anyone with influence, anyone who might challenge him. They were accused of conspiracy, of treason, of plotting with the Allies to assassinate Lopez and end the war. There was no evidence. There did not need to be. Lopez had decided. They were guilty. That was enough. The prisoners were tortured. Paraguayan soldiers, men who had fought and bled for their country, were whipped until their backs were raw. They were beaten with clubs. They were burned. They were stretched on racks until their joints separated. Under torture, they confessed. They confessed to whatever Lopez wanted to hear. They named other conspirators, friends, colleagues, anyone whose name came to mind through the haze of pain. Those people were arrested too, and tortured, and forced to confess. The circle of traitors grew wider and wider. Lopez executed them in batches, lined them up and shot them, cut their throats, ran them through with lances. The bodies piled up in mass graves around the town of San Fernando. No one knows exactly how many died. Hundreds, perhaps over 1,000. The records are incomplete. Lopez was not interested in keeping count. He killed his own brothers. Venancio Lopez and Benigno Lopez had served their brother faithfully. They had supported his war. They had never shown any sign of disloyalty. It did not matter. Lopez decided they were part of the conspiracy. He had them arrested, tortured, and executed. His own blood, His own family, dead on his orders. He turned on his mother. Juana Pabla Carrillo de López was an old woman. She had raised Francisco. She had watched him become president. She had supported him through everything. López accused her of treason. He had her arrested. He had her flogged, whipped in front of his soldiers. His own mother, beaten like a criminal. Some accounts say she died from the abuse. Others say she survived but never recovered. Either way, López had crossed a line that no son should cross. He was no longer fighting a war. He was destroying everything he touched. Eliza Lynch stayed by his side. His Irish mistress had followed him from Paris to Paraguay. She had shared his dreams of glory. She had encouraged his ambitions. Now she watched him murder his own family. She watched him torture his own officers. She watched him drag Paraguay into oblivion. She stayed anyway. Some historians say she was a prisoner, trapped by circumstance, unable to escape. Others say she was a willing participant, as mad as López himself. Others say she simply loved him, and love makes people blind. We will never know what she truly thought. She survived the war. She never explained. While López killed imaginary traitors, the real enemy kept advancing. The Allies pushed north, following López into the wilderness. They were tired. They had been fighting for 5 years. They wanted the war to end. But the Treaty of the Triple Alliance was clear. The war ended when López was dead or surrendered. Until then, they would keep coming. López kept retreating. Every few weeks he moved his camp further into the interior, further from the Allies, further from civilization. His army shrank with every mile. Disease took men. Desertion took men. Starvation took men. The soldiers who remained were skeletons, malnourished, exhausted, held together by nothing but fear of their own commander. And still, López demanded more troops. The conscription orders went out again and again. Every male who could hold a weapon. Every boy who could walk. The age limit dropped to 12, then to 10, then to 9. Children were pulled from their families. Mothers screamed, fathers begged. It made no difference. The soldiers took the boys anyway. Some of these children had never been away from home. Some had never held anything heavier than a farming tool. Some still played with toys. They were given uniforms, often too large, hanging off their thin frames. They were given weapons, often broken or rusted, barely functional. They were taught to march, to shoot, to die. They were not soldiers. They were sacrifices. The army that López now commanded was a horror. Old men who could barely see, wounded veterans missing limbs, hobbling on, crutches, boys who had not yet reached puberty, and women. Paraguayan women had been holding the country together for years. They farmed the land. They made the clothes. They cared for the wounded. Now some of them picked up weapons too. They called themselves the residentes, the women who stayed. They followed the army. They fought when they had to. They died alongside the men and boys. Paraguay was not fielding an army anymore. It was fielding a nation's corpse. In August 1869, the Allies caught up. López had established a position near the town of Piribabay. It was a defensive line, trenches and fortifications manned by his ragged forces. The Allies attacked on August 12th. The Battle of Piribabay was a slaughter. The Paraguayan defenders fought hard. They held their positions for hours, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched. The Allied assault broke through. What followed was not a battle, it was an execution. The Allies showed no mercy. They had been fighting this war for 5 years. They had watched their friends die. They had seen the atrocities López committed. They were done being patient. Paraguayan soldiers who surrendered were killed anyway. Wounded men lying in the trenches were bayoneted. The town itself was burned. Reports vary on the casualties. Some say 1,600 Paraguayans died. Some say more. The Allies lost only a few hundred. López escaped again. He fled north with his remaining forces. But the Battle of Piribabay had taken almost everyone he had left. The few thousand soldiers he had scraped together were now a few hundred. He needed time. He needed to put distance between himself and the Allies. He needed a rearguard. López looked at what remained of his army. He made a calculation. The Allied forces pursuing him numbered around 20,000. Veteran troops, well supplied, fresh from victory. To slow them down, He needed to leave men behind, men who would fight and die while he escaped. He chose the children. General Bernardino Caballero was given command. He was a competent officer, one of the few Lopez had not executed. He was ordered to hold a position near a place called Acosta New. He was given 3,500 soldiers. Most of them were boys between 9 and 15 years old. Some were elderly men, too old to march quickly. Some were wounded soldiers, too broken to retreat. They were the ones Lopez could afford to lose. The children knew what was happening. They were not stupid. They understood that they had been left behind. They understood that 20,000 soldiers were coming. They understood what the math meant. Some of them cried. Some of them prayed. Some of them stood in silence, too shocked to react. Their officers tried to prepare them. They handed out what weapons they had: rifles, machetes, sharpened sticks. They distributed ammunition, though there was not enough for everyone. And they gave the boys charcoal to draw beards on their faces. A desperate disguise, children pretending to be men. The night before the battle, some of the boys wrote letters to their mothers, to their sisters. They gave the letters to the women who had followed the army, hoping somehow the words would make it home. Most of the letters did not survive. The words are lost, but the images remain. Children with painted beards, children carrying sticks, children standing in a line, waiting for dawn. On the morning of August 16, 1869, the sun rose over Acosta New. The Brazilian cavalry appeared on the horizon. 20,000 soldiers, the largest force the children had ever seen. General Caballero looked at his army. He looked at the boys. He looked at the enemy. There was nothing left to say. The Brazilians began their advance. The field was flat and open, nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. The children stood in rough lines across the grass. Some clutched rifles. Some held machetes. Some gripped wooden sticks, poles sharpened to a point, the only weapons left. Their painted beards looked absurd in the morning light, smeared charcoal on soft faces, boys pretending to be what they were not. Across the field, the Brazilian army assembled. 20,000 men, infantry in ordered ranks, cavalry on the flanks, horses stamping, riders checking their weapons, artillery batteries unlimbering their guns. The Brazilian commander was the Count d'Eu. He was married to the daughter of the Brazilian emperor. He had come to Paraguay to end the war. He had come to kill Lopez. He looked across the field. He saw the small figures. He saw the fake beards. He knew what he was looking at. Years later, Brazilian officers would write about this moment. They would describe the unease that ran through the ranks. The soldiers could see that the enemy was children. They could see the painted faces, the oversized uniforms, the thin arms struggling to hold weapons. Some officers reportedly asked to negotiate, to offer the children a chance to surrender, to find some way, any way, to avoid what was about to happen. The Count d'Eu refused. These were enemy combatants. The war would not end until Lopez was captured. Every hour of delay gave Lopez more time to escape. The orders stood. At approximately 8 in the morning, the Brazilian artillery opened fire. The first shells exploded among the Paraguayan lines. Dirt and smoke erupted into the air. Boys who had never experienced combat froze in terror. Some ran. Some screamed. Some stood paralyzed, unable to move. Their officers tried to hold them together, shouted commands, grabbed shoulders, pointed at the enemy. The children who had rifles fired back. Most of them missed. They had barely been trained. They did not know how to aim. They did not know how to reload quickly. They just pointed their weapons at the distant shapes and pulled the trigger. It made no difference. The Brazilian cavalry charged. Thousands of horsemen swept across the field. The thunder of hooves drowned out everything else. The ground shook. The air filled with dust. The children saw them coming. A wall of horses and men, sabers drawn, bearing down at full gallop. Some boys tried to form a line. They planted their sticks in the ground like spears, the way they had been taught. They braced for impact. The cavalry hit them like a wave hitting sand. The lines dissolved. Boys were knocked down, trampled, ridden over. Horses crashed through the formations, scattering the defenders. Sabers flashed downward, again and again. The fighting broke into chaos. Small groups of children tried to resist, They swung their machetes at the horses' legs. They jabbed with their sharpened sticks. They fought with rocks, with fists, with anything they could grab. Some of them actually brought down cavalrymen. A lucky blow, a horse stumbling, a rider pulled from his saddle and swarmed by boys who stabbed and beat until he stopped moving. But for every Brazilian who fell, dozens of children died. The cavalry reformed and charged again and again. Each pass cut deeper into the Paraguayan lines. Each pass left more small bodies on the grass. General Caballero tried to organize a retreat. He gathered the survivors, those who could still move, and pulled back toward a patch of woods at the edge of the field. Some kind of cover, some kind of protection. The Brazilians followed. The fighting in the woods was even worse. Close quarters, no room to maneuver. Children hiding behind trees, ambushing Brazilian soldiers who pushed through the undergrowth. Bayonets and machetes in the shadows. The Brazilians took casualties here. The confined space neutralized some of their advantages. Men were stabbed before they saw their attackers. Officers were pulled from their horses and killed. But the numbers were overwhelming. For every gap the children opened, more soldiers poured through. The woods filled with gunfire and screaming. By midday, it was nearly over. The surviving children were scattered. Some had fled into the countryside. Some were hiding in the tall grass, hoping the cavalry would not find them. Some were wounded, lying where they had fallen, waiting to die. The Brazilians began sweeping the field. They walked through the grass in lines, searching for survivors. When they found Paraguayan soldiers, men, boys, anyone still alive, they killed them. Witnesses described what happened next. Children who surrendered were shot. Children who begged for mercy were bayoneted. Some boys fell to their knees, crying, pleading in Guarani, the native language the Brazilians did not understand. It did not save them. One account describes children clinging to the legs of Brazilian soldiers, grabbing their boots, begging not to be killed. The soldiers killed them anyway. This was not the action of a few cruel men. It was systematic. Orders had been given, or implied, that no prisoners would be taken. The Paraguayan army, such as it was, would be destroyed completely. The Count d'Eu wanted the war to end. Dead children could not fight tomorrow. Then the fires started. The grass on the battlefield was dry. It was August, late winter in the southern hemisphere, but the vegetation was parched. Someone, Brazilian soldiers, or perhaps the fires from artillery, ignited it. The flames spread quickly. Within minutes, the field was burning. Smoke billowed into the sky. The fire raced through the tall grass, consuming everything in its path, including the wounded. Boys who could not walk, boys with shattered legs, with bullets in their stomachs, with saber cuts across their bodies, were caught in the flames. They could not escape. They could not even crawl fast enough. They burned alive. Witnesses described the sounds, the screaming that rose from the burning grass, the high-pitched cries of children being consumed by fire. Some Brazilian soldiers reportedly tried to help. They ran into the smoke, pulling wounded boys to safety. Others stood and watched. Others added to the flames. The burning lasted hours. When it finally stopped, the field was black, charred grass, charred bodies, smoke hanging in the air like a funeral shroud. The count of the dead was never precise. Brazilian records claimed around 2,000 Paraguayans killed. Some historians believe the number was higher. The bodies were so badly burned, so scattered across the field, that an accurate count was impossible. Brazilian casualties, 46 dead, 259 wounded, 46 men, against more than 2,000 children. The numbers tell the story. This was not a battle. It was an extermination. The American ambassador to Paraguay at the time was a man named Martin McMahon. He had watched the war unfold. He had seen what it had done to the country. After Acosta knew, he wrote a report. He described the Paraguayan army he had observed in its final months. More than half of the army, he wrote, were children between 10 and 14 years of age. He was not exaggerating. By 1869, Paraguay had no one else left. A Brazilian officer named Alfredo Descragnol Tonei was present at the battle. He later became Viscount of Tonei, a titled nobleman. He wrote memoirs of his time in the war. His account of Acosta New is haunted. He described the children's courage, how they fought despite everything, how they refused to run even when the cavalry bore down on them. He described their deaths, methodical, merciless, complete. He did not try to justify what happened. He simply recorded it, a witness to horror, putting words on paper so the world would know. The world did not pay much attention. The War of the Triple Alliance was far away, a conflict in South America between countries most Europeans could not find on a map. But Paraguay remembered. General Caballero survived. He escaped the field with a handful of soldiers and made his way back to Lopez. He reported what had happened. The rearguard had held for hours. It had bought the time Lopez needed. Lopez received the news without emotion. He had sacrificed 3,500 children to save himself. He had left them to die on a burning field so he could run a little further. He did not mourn them. He did not thank them. He simply continued his retreat. He was already planning his next move, already thinking about survival, already convinced that somehow, someway he could still win. The children of Acosta knew were already forgotten, but Lopez was still running, and the Brazilians were still coming. 6 months. That is how long the chase would last. Lopez had almost nothing left. A few hundred soldiers, his mistress, his children, a handful of loyalists too afraid to leave. They fled deeper into the wilderness. North, always north, into the forests and swamps of the Paraguayan interior, where the roads disappeared and the jungle swallowed everything. The Allies followed. They were tired. The war had lasted nearly 6 years. Brazil had spent fortunes. Argentina had bled. They wanted it to end. But the Treaty of the Triple Alliance was clear. The war ended when Lopez was dead or surrendered. Lopez would never surrender. For 6 more months, the chase continued. Lopez moved from camp to camp. He stayed a few days, a few weeks, then moved again when the Brazilians got close. His army, or if you could call it that, shrank with every march. Men deserted. Men died from disease and starvation. Men simply collapsed and could not get up. The dictator, who had once commanded 30,000 soldiers, was now leading a band of refugees through the jungle. But he still gave orders. He still demanded obedience. He still executed anyone he suspected of disloyalty. The paranoia never stopped. Even now, surrounded by the last people on earth who had not abandoned him, Lopez saw traitors everywhere. He had men tortured for imaginary crimes. He had men shot for looking at him wrong. Eliza Lynch stayed with him. So did their children. They had nowhere else to go. The Brazilians closed in slowly. They did not need to. Hurry! Lopez was trapped. The jungle was his prison. Sooner or later they would find him. On March 1st, 1870, they did. Lopez had made camp near a stream called Aquidauban in a place called Cerro Corá. It was deep in the northern wilderness. He thought he was safe. He was wrong. A Brazilian cavalry force had tracked him for weeks. They had followed the trail of abandoned camps, dead horses, and starving deserters. They knew exactly where he was. At dawn, they attacked. The Brazilians swept into the camp before Lopez's men could react. There was no battle, just chaos. Soldiers running, horses screaming, gunfire echoing through the trees. Lopez tried to escape. He mounted a horse and rode for the stream. If he could cross the water, maybe he could disappear into the jungle again. Maybe he could keep running. A Brazilian lance caught him in the stomach. He fell from his horse into the shallow water. Blood spread around him. He tried to stand. He could not. Brazilian soldiers surrounded him. Their commander, General José Antonio Correa da Câmara, pushed through the crowd. Câmara looked down at the man who had caused so much death, the dictator who had started a war he could not win, the madman who had sacrificed his own country rather than admit defeat. Lopez was dying. The lance wound was fatal, but he was still alive, still conscious. Câmara made an offer. Surrender. Give up your sword. The war will end. Your life will be spared. It was more mercy than Lopez deserved. After everything he had done, the massacres, the executions, the children sent to die, the Brazilians were offering to let him live. Lopez looked up at the general. He raised his sword. Muero con mi patria. I die with my nation. He swung at Câmara. A weak blow. The sword barely moved. A Brazilian soldier shot him. Francisco Solano Lopez died in the stream at Cerro Corá. He was 43 years old. He had ruled Paraguay for 8 years. He had been at war for 6 of them. His last words were a lie. He was not dying with his nation. His nation was already dead. He had killed it himself. Eliza Lynch was captured nearby. She survived. She would eventually return to Europe, where she lived until 1886. Before she left Cherokora, she did one last thing. She dug a grave with her own hands. She buried Lopez in the Paraguayan soil, the man she had loved, the man she had followed into madness. She never explained why she stayed with him. She never apologized. She never expressed regret. Some mysteries do not have answers. The war was over. It had lasted 6 years. It had killed more people, proportionally, than almost any war in modern history. The numbers are difficult to comprehend. Before the war, Paraguay had between 450,000 and 525,000 people. Historians still debate the exact figure. After the war, a census counted 221,000 survivors. More than half the country was gone, but the gender breakdown was even worse. Only 28,000 adult men remained, out of an estimated 100,000 or more before the war. 90% of Paraguay's men were dead. The country that emerged from the war was a nation of women, children, and old people. In some regions, the ratio of women to men was 20-1. There were villages with no adult males at all. Women did everything. They farmed the land. They rebuilt the houses. They raised the children, many of them fatherless. They became the backbone of a country that had lost its bones. The territorial losses were staggering. Brazil and Argentina carved up nearly 40% of Paraguay's pre-war territory. Land that had been Paraguayan for generations was simply taken. The borders were redrawn by the victors. Paraguay was occupied. Allied troops remained for years. The country was looted. Whatever wealth remained was stripped away. War debts were imposed that Paraguay would not finish paying until 1943. 73 years to pay for a war that lasted 6. Paraguay did not recover for decades. Some historians argue it never fully recovered. The demographic collapse, the territorial losses, the economic devastation, the scars are still visible today. All of it because one man wanted to be Napoleon. But here is the strangest part of the story. Francisco Solano Lopez is a national hero in Paraguay. Not a villain, not a cautionary tale, a hero. His birthday, July 24th, is Army Day in Paraguay. His death, March 1st, is National Heroes Day. His body was eventually moved to the Pantheon of Heroes in Asunción, where it lies alongside Paraguay's greatest patriots. Streets are named after him. Statues have been built. Children learn about him in school as the defender of Paraguay against foreign aggression. The man who destroyed his country is worshipped as its greatest patriot. How is this possible? The answer depends on who you ask. Some Paraguayans see Lopez as a martyr, a man who fought to the end against overwhelming odds, a leader who refused to surrender his nation's sovereignty even when surrender was the only rational choice. From this perspective, the Triple Alliance was the aggressor. Brazil and Argentina wanted to dominate South America. They wanted to crush any nation that challenged their power. Lopez stood up to them. He lost, but he never gave in. His final words, "I die with my nation," are seen not as delusion, but as defiance, a declaration that Paraguay would never kneel, that even in death, Lopez represented something unconquerable. Other Paraguayans see him differently. They see a dictator who started a war he could not win, a narcissist who sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives for his own ego, a madman who executed his own family and sent children to die rather than admit he was wrong. From this perspective, Lopez did not save Paraguay. He nearly erased it from the map. The country survived despite him, not because of him. Both views exist. They coexist, uncomfortably, in the same national memory. Perhaps the truth is that Paraguay needed a hero. After the war, the country was broken, occupied, humiliated. The people who remained had lost everything: their families, their homes, their future. They needed something to believe in, someone who represented resistance, even if that resistance was futile. Someone who proved that Paraguay had fought, that Paraguay had not simply surrendered. Lopez became that symbol, not because he deserved it, because Paraguay needed him to be. The dead cannot argue. The dead can be shaped into whatever the living require. The children of Acosta knew are also remembered. Today, August 16th, is a national holiday in Paraguay. It is called Día del Niño, Children's Day. It does not celebrate childhood. It commemorates the children who died at Acosta Ñu, the boys with painted beards, the boys with sharpened sticks, the boys who stood in a field and faced an army because a madman would not surrender. Every year, Paraguayans remember. Schools hold ceremonies, families visit memorials. The names of the dead, those that are known, are read aloud. It is the only Children's Day in the world dedicated to children who were slaughtered in a war. They are honored as martyrs, as symbols of sacrifice, as proof that Paraguay fought until there was no one left to fight. But they were also victims of a leader who valued his own survival above their lives, victims of a war that should have ended years before they were born. Heroes and victims, both things at once. Paraguay holds both truths. It has no choice. The sun sets over Asunción. The city has been rebuilt. The streets are full. Life has returned to a country that once had almost no one left. But the monuments remain, the memorials, the holidays that commemorate the dead. March 1st, the day Lopez died. August 16th, the day the children died. Paraguay does not forget. It cannot forget. The war took too much. The scars run too deep. Francisco Solano Lopez wanted to be Napoleon. He got his wish, in a way. Napoleon is remembered. Lopez is remembered. Both men led their nations to destruction. Both men refused to stop until it was too late. But Napoleon lost an empire. Lopez lost almost everyone. Nearly 500,000 people, reduced to 221,000. An entire generation of men erased. Children sent to die on a burning field. All because one man could not admit he was wrong. Was he a patriot or a monster? Did he fight for Paraguay's honor? Or did he destroy Paraguay for his pride? The answer depends on what you need to believe. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. Tell me, how do you see Lopez? Hero or villain? And did you know about the children of Acosta Ñu before today? Subscribe and turn on notifications if you want more stories like this.